The lot sits at the far edge of town, boxed in by leaning maples and a rusted chain-link fence that sags under its own weight. Even in summer, when weeds force their way through cracked sidewalks and moss covers the stone church steps, the ground here stays bare. A pale, ashy dirt that refuses seed and spits out rainwater as if the earth itself is rejecting life. The old people say nothing when they pass it. They cross the street looking down, their shadows stretching long and thin in the late afternoon light. At night there is only stillness, yet every window facing the lot is shut tight, curtains drawn, no matter the heat. There are no stray dogs here, no birds, not even the sound of insects. The silence clings heavy as if it remembers something it cannot let go of. Beneath this surface is where the Coldwell School once stood, a proud brick building that opened in 1892 and was torn down less than 2 decades later. Official records say its closure was due to funding and structural concerns, but that explanation sits poorly when you read the minutes from the town council meeting in March of 1910. The wording is clipped and oddly defensive, the signatures faded but still legible, as though each pen stroke tried to end the matter without speaking it. In the archive, the air smells of paper left too close to damp stone, and the clerk's voice trembles when asked for the Coldwell files. She hands them over quickly as if eager to have them out of her grasp. The oldest documents are brittle enough to flake at the edges, their ink browned into a faint, spidery script. At first glance, the school's history seems ordinary. Attendance sheets, supply orders, repair invoices. But here and there, the handwriting changes, the tone shifts, and small notes in the margins appear. Some in red pencil, others in a strange, looping hand that does not match any listed staff. The notes are vague, like instructions to someone who already knew what to do. Phrases such as, "Prepare 3 more," "Do not let them touch the floor," and "Singing continues without error," are scattered between requests for chalk and replacement desks. The oldest residents, the ones who have lived long enough to see their friends buried, offer little when asked about the school. They speak slowly, choosing words like one chooses fruit, picking only those that are safe to touch. One man claims the ground was salted after the demolition, but when pressed, he insists it was only to keep weeds from taking over. Another woman says the place was cleaned in the spring of 1910. Her voice flattening on the word until it sounds less like tidying and more like erasure. They avoid eye contact when the conversation lingers, their faces setting in a look that belongs to people who have promised themselves never to recall certain nights. Every account ends with a pause, a glance toward the lot, and then silence. The air there is wrong, they say. Too still, too heavy, like a room that has just been emptied of breath. And though decades have passed, the shape of the building still exists in the minds of those who saw it. The long hallway with windows on one side, the smell of varnished wood and something faintly sweet, the faint echo of children's shoes on polished floors. Yet beneath that memory is another quieter one, never told aloud but etched deep enough to outlive the bricks. It is not the kind of thing that leaves when the building falls. The ground remembers. And whatever was done inside those walls seems to have seeped into the soil, holding fast, waiting for anyone willing, or foolish, enough to start asking questions. Miss Theodora Alden came to Coldwell in the winter of 1893, arriving with 2 small trunks, a black parasol, and a letter of recommendation from a distant academy whose name has since faded from all official records. In the photographs that survive, she stands tall with her hands folded neatly at her waist, her hair pinned so tight it casts no shadow on her temples, her smile composed in a way that reveals nothing of warmth or cold. The parents adored her from the start. She spoke softly at meetings, never raising her voice, yet somehow her words settled disputes without argument. She dressed in deep colors that never wrinkled, her gloves spotless even in the mud of March, her boots leaving no trace on the school's wood floors. They said she had the patience of a saint, that she could take the most unruly child and within months turn them into a model pupil. The phrase they used most often was polishing rough children into gold, and they repeated it with pride, never asking where the tarnish went or how the shine was made to last. The children who entered her classroom each autumn emerged by spring quieter, more precise in their movements, their handwriting uniform, their gaze steady and unreadable. Yet if you met one of these prize students years later in the market or on the road, they would not speak of those days. Their eyes would shift away, their voices falter, as if the memory was a locked door with no key left in the world. There are no written lesson plans in the archives, no notes on teaching methods, only flawless attendance records and essays bound together in perfect script that looks less like a child's hand and more like an imitation of one. Beneath the surface of her refinement was a mind that believed in absolute order, not as a tool for learning, but as a form of reshaping. She saw the small flaws in a child, the tremor in a voice, the restless tapping of a finger, the uneven rhythm of a breath, as signs of a deeper disorder that had to be removed. Her work, as she understood it, was not to instruct but to correct. In this she was methodical, almost clinical, hiding her precision behind the gentility of lace collars and well-polished shoes. Parents saw the smiles on school picture day and mistook them for happiness, never noticing how each one was identical in tilt and tension as if traced from the same model. Those who worked beside her rarely lasted more than a year. They complained of a heaviness in the air of her classroom, a stillness that deepened as the months wore on, and a faint, unpleasant scent that clung to the materials she kept locked in her cabinet. She told them it was the smell of varnish from old desks, but they all agreed it was sweeter, almost metallic, the kind of scent that lingers long after it should fade. No one could say exactly what happened between the ringing of the morning bell and the afternoon dismissal, only that the children never seemed tired, yet moved with the kind of care one uses in unfamiliar places. It was as though they had been trained not to disturb the air around them. Miss Alden maintained the illusion of normalcy with skill, hosting end-of-year recitals and displaying her pupils' work in neat rows on the hallway walls. Yet the truth was that her definition of gold had little to do with achievement and everything to do with obedience. She did not seek to draw out potential. She sought to erase what she deemed imperfect, until nothing of the child remained but a polished shell. And whatever she did to achieve that, she kept hidden, not just from the parents but from the world, preserved only in the changed faces of those she called her prize students. The roster was found in the town archive, pressed flat between two warped attendance ledgers, its paper thin as onion skin and tinted the yellow of slow decay. At first it seemed unremarkable, a list of names in tight columns, each followed by neat check marks running in unbroken lines from September to June. But the first unease came when a familiar name appeared. Clara Wicks, 9 years old, perfect attendance. Though the archivist remembered that Clara's headstone in the cemetery bore the date February 3, 1897. She was not the only one. 7 more children on the list had burial records dated months before the school year ended. Yet here they were, marked present every day as if death itself could not excuse them. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, without hesitation, each letter formed with the same precise pressure, as though the writer feared a single slip might betray something. Then there was the symbol. It appeared beside some names, not many, only 13 in all. A small, curved mark that did not match any grading notation used at the time. It was not a cross or an initial, but a shape that seemed almost to be closing in on itself. A loop drawn tight, without a visible start or end. The ink of these marks was darker, fresher somehow, as though it resisted fading while the rest of the page surrendered to age. Attempts to match the mark to known shorthand or printer's symbols failed, but the positioning was always exact. 1 finger's width to the right of the final check mark, never touching the name, never touching the date. The deeper one studied the list, the more it felt less like a record of attendance and more like an inventory, not of students but of completions. This was not a register of who came and went each day. It was a tally of who had been fully claimed. The parents, of course, never saw this page. They were shown only the public charts pinned in the hallway, which bore different handwriting and different numbers with absences clearly marked. But this private roster was not meant to be displayed. It was meant to track a separate order, one that existed beneath the veneer of normal schooling. Whoever kept it did so with obsessive precision, ensuring that no gaps appeared, even if it meant marking a dead child as present for months after their burial. In that logic, the child's body was irrelevant. What mattered was that their place, whatever that truly meant, remained filled. The symbol seemed to signify a further stage, something beyond mere attendance, a state achieved by only a select few. And in the brittle silence of the archive room, the thought took root that these 13 marked names were the ones Miss Alden considered her true prize students. Not the children who excelled in lessons, but those who had been taken to the very end of her hidden process. The paper itself gave off the faint odor of iron and mildew, an unlikely scent for documents stored in a dry cabinet. It clung to the fingertips after turning the page, and it was not the kind of smell that faded quickly. By the time the archivist returned the roster to its folder, the unease had deepened into a certainty. Coldwell's perfect attendance was not a boast of good health or discipline. It was the signature of a closed system, a quiet machinery running parallel to the school's public face, and it did not stop for death. The wooden stage in Coldwell's small auditorium had always seemed ordinary, a place for end-of-year recitals, holiday readings, and the occasional speech from the mayor when he wanted to be seen among the families. But those who knew where to look spoke of a narrow trapdoor hidden under the rear planks, masked by a false join in the wood grain. The door led down a set of steep steps into a space no larger than a pantry, walls sweating with damp even in summer. The ceiling was low enough that an adult had to stoop, and the only light came from a single glass lamp mounted to the far wall, its flame guttering from the constant cold draft. This was where Miss Alden kept what she called her special learning materials, though nothing inside resembled books or chalk or the kind of objects a teacher might use for study. According to 2 surviving janitors, the air down there carried a smell both metallic and sweet, like a spoon held too long in the mouth and left to tarnish, a smell that clung to their skin for hours after cleaning. They described shelves stacked with small objects wrapped in waxed paper, a tall jar of cloudy liquid in which pale shapes floated, and a narrow table with straps fixed at each corner, the leather worn smooth in the middle. The janitors were never allowed to linger. They were told to sweep, to mop, to leave without touching anything. The few times they disobeyed, they found odd scuffs on the floorboards near the table, as though something heavy had been dragged across and then dragged back. No one could explain why the children chosen for these so-called excellence lessons were never selected twice, and why they returned to class after an absence of only a few hours with their hair damp, their skin cold, and their eyes fixed on nothing. They sat straighter at their desks, moved slower, spoke less. Whatever happened in that room was not meant to be seen by anyone but Miss Alden. Yet the results were visible enough to anyone paying attention. Parents praised the change, mistaking stillness for maturity, mistaking quiet for discipline, never asking why their children seemed to flinch when the school bell rang. Rumors whispered among the older students claimed that the excellence lessons involved learning without speaking, that the mind could be made to remember perfectly if the body was made perfectly still, and that Miss Alden had a way of keeping a child so still they forgot how to move on their own. Some said she placed their hands in basins of freezing water until the skin burned and the nails went pale, making them recite numbers they could not see. Others claimed she pressed strange, cold shapes into their palms and made them describe them in exact detail until their voices broke. These stories were never told to outsiders, never spoken above a murmur, because every child understood that to be called behind the stage was to be marked. Years later, when the building stood empty and the boards of the stage began to warp, workers found faint lines scratched into the underside. Small marks, almost like tallies, clustered in groups of 13. The trapdoor was pried open one final time before demolition, and those who stood at its edge swore that the cold rose up like breath from a living thing, heavy with the scent of iron and rot. They did not linger. The room was emptied, its contents removed without record. But the dust that clung to the workers' hands would not wash away for days, as though the place had left its own quiet mark. And in the silence that followed, the stories of the room behind the stage only grew sharper, each retelling bringing the same unshakable truth: that whatever was done there had less to do with learning and more to do with keeping something hidden, finished, and under Miss Alden's perfect control. In a locked drawer inside the town's archive, beneath stacks of unrelated property deeds, there were 3 small leather-bound journals, their pages so tightly written that the ink bled through in places. They were signed in Theodora Alden's precise hand, though nowhere did she name the school or herself directly. Instead, she referred to the work and to subjects, never pupils, never children. Her words outlined a philosophy she called the method of quiet minds. The belief that a child's mind was a vessel that needed to be completely emptied before any true knowledge could remain. She wrote that unrest took many forms: nervous habits, stubbornness, laughter at the wrong time, even the spark in the eyes that suggested private thoughts. These, she said, were defects to be removed, not tolerated. The process she described was deliberate and without haste. First, the subject was stripped of their name. This was not symbolic to her. She insisted on a total severing, referring to them only as unit, followed by a number. Then, blindfolded, the child was led into a chamber she described only as the quiet place, where a basin of water was kept at a temperature just above freezing. The subject stood barefoot in it while a cold metal plate was pressed into their hands. On the plate were symbols invisible to the eye but cut in deep, twisting lines. The task was to trace them exactly with the fingertips, over and over, while she stood in silence behind them. The exercise continued for hours, the water numbing the feet until sensation disappeared, the blindfold forcing the mind to rely only on touch. She claimed that after a certain point the child would stop trembling, stop shifting, and their breathing would fall into perfect rhythm. That was the moment she sought. The breaking of unrest, the moment the mind gave in. In her notes, she described satisfaction at watching them stand for nearly half a day without protest, their faces slack, their hands still moving with mechanical obedience over shapes they could not name. She called these moments completions, though the term appeared in the margins without further explanation. The journals contain no acknowledgement of harm, only cold observations. Unit 5 no longer blinks when plate is removed. Unit 11 steady, may advance. Yet between the lines was the quiet horror of a mind that saw erasure as achievement, that measured success not by what a child learned but by how much of themselves they forgot. When these journals were found, the archivist who handled them swore the pages were cold to the touch, though the drawer had been locked in a warm room. and though no date was given for each session, the sequence of entries aligned too neatly with the names in the perfect attendance list. Each completion, a life that returned to the classroom forever changed, or perhaps no longer truly present at all. The notebook belonged to Edward Kirk, Coldwell's short-lived music instructor, who resigned after less than 1 year without giving a reason. Bound in worn cloth and filled with careful handwriting, it was at first nothing but pages of scales, lesson plans, and transcriptions of simple songs. But halfway through, the tone shifted. The entries began describing a machine Alden had commissioned from a clockmaker in the next county, a device resembling an oversized tuning fork bolted to a wooden base, with a winding mechanism that struck its prongs at regular intervals. Kirk noted that the pitch it produced was not one used in music, nor could it be matched by any instrument. It was too low to be pleasant, yet too high to ignore, a vibration that seemed to hum in the back of the skull. During the first demonstration, he wrote, "The children shifted in their seats, pressing hands to their ears, their eyes watering. By the 5th minute, 1 child vomited onto the floor. By the 10th, 3 more had lost bladder control. Alden showed no alarm. She simply instructed them to remain seated. At 20 minutes, most had stopped moving entirely, their expressions emptied of resistance." Kirk wrote that those who endured the sound for over an hour emerged from the session not dazed, but strangely composed, their posture straighter, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on the ground unless spoken to directly. In later entries, he described feeling the sound himself when passing the closed door of her classroom. Even through the wood, the vibration made his teeth ache and the hair on his arms stand up. It was not music, he realized, but conditioning. A method to break the body through the mind, to use sound not to teach rhythm, but to erase it from within. The town never heard this tone. Its reach was kept strictly within the school's walls, and Alden ensured that no other class ran when her sessions took place. Kirk's final note was short, written in a shaky hand. "This is not for learning. This is to make them hers." He left the school that week, abandoning his post and leaving his piano behind. Years later, when demolition workers cleared the building, they found the fork itself, rusted but still intact, wedged into the joists above the old music room. Those who touched it said they felt a faint hum travel up their arm, as if the metal still remembered the frequency, waiting for someone to strike it again. Henry Coates was small for his age, with hair so pale it almost looked white in winter sunlight. In April of 1898, he was called to Miss Alden's private study during the final lesson of the day. Witnesses remembered him leaving his seat without hesitation, his slate tucked under his arm, the way Alden liked her pupils to carry it. He never returned. No formal search was made. Alden informed the class the next morning that Henry had been taken ill and would be recovering at home. Yet his desk was never reassigned, and within a week, a boy of the same height and hair color sat there each morning. The children whispered that it was not Henry, though his clothes were the same. This boy did not speak, did not look at anyone, and did not raise his hand. His movements were slow, mechanical, his eyes fixed on the board as though seeing nothing at all. In the class photo taken that June, he sits in the second row, hands folded neatly, his expression utterly blank. The photograph from the following year shows him again. Unchanged in height, unchanged in dress, unchanged in the lifelessness of his face. He appears once more in 1900, still without alteration, though the other children around him have grown, their features shifting with age. No explanation was ever given, and no parent came forward to claim the boy. The town records list Henry Coates as deceased in late April of 1898, cause unknown. Yet the perfect attendance list marks his name through to the end of that school year and again for the 2 years that follow. Some suggested that the boy was a relative filling in for photographs, but no family of Henry's ever lived in Coldwell after his disappearance. Others in hushed tones wondered if Alden had found a way to preserve a child beyond the point of living, keeping the form without the life inside it. By the time the final class photo was taken in 1901, the figure was gone. His desk was empty and his name vanished from the rosters entirely. No burial was recorded, no belongings left behind. Only the photographs remain, each one showing the same pale-haired boy staring through the lens with eyes that seem less like windows to a soul than a seal over something no one should have seen. The blizzard began in late January, the kind that buried fences and swallowed roads overnight. By the second morning, the school doors were locked, and Miss Alden stood at the window, turning away any parent who came to collect their child. She claimed it was too dangerous for them to travel in the snow and that the children were safer inside. For 14 days, no one entered or left the building. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney and lights burned in the upper floors through the long, dim afternoons, but no laughter or shouting carried across the frozen yard. On the 15th day, the doors opened and the children emerged into the brittle cold. Every one of them had hair cut close to the scalp, their heads pale against the gray sky. Their hands were bare, revealing raw skin where fingernails had once been. The parents gasped, rushing forward, but the children did not run to them. Instead, they gathered in a line by the steps and began to sing in perfect unison. The song was unlike anything the parents had heard. Not in English, not in any hymn or folk tune known to the town. The notes were sharp, deliberate, each held for the same length, each voice indistinguishable from the next. When the last note faded, the children fell silent, their eyes downcast, and only then did they step toward their parents. Several families left town that same day, packing their belongings and disappearing before nightfall. Those who remained tried to speak with their children, but the answers were short and vague, and none of them recalled the song. Some claimed not to remember the fortnight at all. The smell of antiseptic lingered on their skin, and their fingertips were smooth as glass. The snow melted in early March, but the yard outside the school remained hard-packed and bare, as if nothing had touched it. And though the incident was never reported beyond the town, it marked a shift in Coldwell. A line crossed in silence, after which no one doubted that whatever Alden was doing inside those walls had nothing to do with education and everything to do with a kind of work no one dared name. The storm rolled in without warning, a hard wind from the east carrying sheets of rain that slapped against shuttered windows. As the town settled into the dark, the sound began, faint at first, threading through the howl of the wind, growing clearer with each gust. It was the same strange song the children had sung after the winter of the locked doors, the same flawless unison, the same unplaceable language. It carried over the rooftops, winding between the alleys, seeping into the ears of those who listened from their beds. The notes rose and fell in a precise pattern, never faltering, until the air itself seemed to hold still to hear it. And then, without warning, the voices cut off mid-phrase, leaving a silence so sudden it made the ears ring. Those awake felt the absence like a blow. The next morning, the school doors were locked tight, the windows shuttered from within. No smoke rose from the chimney. By noon, word spread that Miss Alden was nowhere to be found. When a group of townsmen forced the doors open, they found the classroom stripped of life. Desks stood in perfect rows, chairs tucked in, the blackboards wiped clean. In the center of the main hall, on 13 desks arranged in a straight line, were neatly folded sets of children's clothing, each placed with deliberate care. On top of each pile rested a dried black rose, its petals brittle yet intact. as though it had been preserved in darkness. The clothes were clean, pressed, their buttons fastened, their socks rolled. No sign of the children themselves remained, no shoes in the cloakroom, no satchels on the hooks, no books left behind. The rest of the building was immaculate, as if prepared for inspection except for a faint, sweet odor that clung to the air, a mix of dust and something floral turned sour. Upstairs in Alden's private study, her desk drawers were empty, her personal belongings gone. Only the ledgers remained, closed and stacked in a neat pile, each with a ribbon tied around it. The 13 black roses crumbled at the slightest touch, leaving dark dust on the fingertips. Their presence felt less like a memorial and more like a mark, a closing of some process only she understood. No footprints marked the wet floors, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. It was as if Alden and the missing children had simply stepped out of the world between one breath and the next, leaving behind only the hushed order she valued above all. Those who entered that morning left quickly, uneasy in the unnatural stillness, each carrying the unspoken knowledge that the silence in the building was not empty at all, but holding something back. The ledger was found years later during the first attempt to demolish what remained of the Coldwell School's foundation. A worker prying loose a section of warped floorboard struck hollow wood beneath, revealing a compartment lined with tin and sealed with a rusted latch. Inside lay a single book, its black leather cover warped with damp, its brass clasp corroded but still locked. When it was finally pried open, the smell was immediate, a metallic sweetness that made the men step back. The pages inside were dense with names written in Alden's sharp, unwavering hand. They were not organized by year or class, but by something else entirely, a private order she never meant for others to see. Next to each name was a date, and beside that a short coded word: washed, cleared, pressed, smoothed, erased. There were no grades, no mentions of attendance or academic progress. The handwriting never faltered, even when the names belonged to children officially listed as dead. Toward the back of the book, the entries grew more condensed, the dates closer together, as though the process had accelerated in her final years. Intermittent among the columns were small stains, at first assumed to be ink blots, but when tested decades later, they were found to contain traces of human cerebrospinal fluid, a detail that raised more questions than anyone dared answer. The codes themselves seemed clinical yet ritualistic, each implying a stage in a transformation. Washed might have referred to the freezing basins described in her journals, cleared perhaps to the blank stillness after the tuning fork's vibrations, erased to the final stage where identity was no longer recoverable. In the margins, faint notations in pencil marked certain names with small loops, the same symbol found in the perfect attendance list beside the 13 chosen. These loops appeared only next to completions that bore the word pressed or erased. There was no index, no explanation, only the relentless precision of record-keeping from someone who valued her own classification over any outside system. The last entry in the ledger was dated the night before she vanished. It bore a name with no birth date, no address, only the word final written in the note column. The ink of that last word was darker than the rest, its pressure heavier, the loop in the letter curling back on itself like a closed snare. When the ledger was removed from its hiding place, the air in the compartment remained cold for hours, as if whatever it had contained for so long had not yet let go. Those who handled it spoke of a strange pressure behind their eyes, a dull ache that lingered even after they set it down. The book now rests in a climate-controlled drawer, sealed in glass, though few have been willing to open it again. It remains less a record of education than a map of possession, the quiet proof of a mind that measured lives not by their beginnings or ends, but by the moment they ceased to belong to themselves. The demolition of the Coldwell School took place in the early hours of a damp autumn morning in 1910, without ceremony, without even a notice in the local paper. By the time the townspeople awoke, half the structure had already been reduced to rubble under the blows of silent-faced workmen brought in from another county. No locals were hired for the task. The official explanation, muttered rather than printed, was structural weakness and a desire to build something new. Yet no replacement was ever constructed on that ground. The bricks, however, did not go to waste. They were loaded onto carts and taken to various sites across town, repurposed for chimneys, retaining walls, and the foundations of new homes. Within months, whispers began. A family in the North Quarter lost their youngest child without trace, their new chimney collapsing the same night. A grocer's shop that had used the bricks for a cellar wall burned to the ground in a fire that left the adjoining buildings untouched. A church hall built with them saw a string of accidents among its Sunday school children, each one stranger than the last. A girl who lost her ability to speak overnight, a boy who woke without memory of his own parents. Another found standing motionless in the hall after dark, humming a song no one recognized. Town leaders dismissed the stories as superstition, pointing out that accidents happen, fires start, children wander. But those who had known the school, who had walked its halls and felt its peculiar stillness, recognized the pattern. They called it a curse, though not the kind born from folklore. This was something embedded, deliberate, a residue of whatever Alden had wrought within those walls. Survivors claimed the bricks still carried the vibrations of the tuning fork, the faint scent of the stage room, the chill of the freezing basins. Some swore that if you pressed your ear to one, you could hear faint voices, each speaking in the same measured tone. Efforts to remove the bricks from public buildings failed. Too many had been mixed into the town's fabric by then. The council voted to move on, filing the matter away under progress. Yet even decades later, the old people avoided those buildings, crossing the street rather than pass too close. And in the rare moments when an accident or disappearance made its way into official record, there was often an unspoken acknowledgement among those who remembered, a brief meeting of eyes, a tightening of the mouth, a thought left unvoiced, another brick claimed. The school was gone, the lot left bare, but the pieces of it had scattered, carrying its quiet, unseen work into the foundations of the town itself, where no demolition could reach. The lot where the Coldwell School once stood remains barren after more than a century, its soil pale and compacted as if pressed down by an invisible hand. On certain autumn nights when the air is still and the leaves hang limp in the trees, the ground gives up its silence. Those living nearby say it begins faintly, a thin hum just at the edge of hearing, like the wind moving through a distant grove. But the sound builds in strange layers, weaving into what can only be described as singing. Not the wavering voices of children at play, but a measured, flawless harmony. Each note is held for the same length, each voice perfectly in time with the others, as though guided by a conductor no one can see. Standing at the fence, the sound seems to rise directly from the earth, without source or direction, growing louder until the air feels taut. Some who have stayed to listen claim that within the harmony are voices not meant for children at all, deeper tones that suggest age or something that has been here far too long. In 1974, a group of paranormal investigators visited the site armed with reel-to-reel recorders, carefully setting up microphones at various points along the perimeter. The equipment captured what the human ear could not separate. Over 30 distinct vocal lines, each with its own pitch and rhythm, layered so intricately that no untrained choir could have produced them without flaw. In one segment, a voice whispered between the harmonies, speaking in a clipped rhythmic pattern, too low to make out fully but steady as a metronome. Spectrogram analysis revealed frequencies below the human range, woven like threads between the audible notes. When the tapes were played back in town, the room fell quiet, the sound flattening the air, leaving listeners with a dull ache at the base of the skull. Authorities refused to release the recordings, dismissing them as environmental artifacts, despite no wind, traffic, or animal noise being present. Those who had been at the site swore the sound lingered in their ears for hours afterward, following them home like a memory they had not chosen to keep. The lot has since been fenced off under the pretense of safety, though no one can recall an injury ever taking place there. Still, on the right nights, with the right patience, the singing comes again, threading through the dark. It never begins or ends in the way a song should. It simply fades in, steady and exact, until the listener feels the weight of the earth pressing up through their feet. And then, just as suddenly, it fades away, leaving the ground silent once more. But not empty, never empty. The trunk was discovered in the summer of 1978 in the attic of a crumbling farmhouse miles from town after the death of its last occupant, a cousin of Miss Theodora Alden. The lock had rusted shut, and the wood was swollen from years of damp. But when it was forced open, the smell that escaped was stale and faintly metallic, as if the air inside had been trapped since the school's final days. Beneath neatly folded garments and brittle lace gloves lay a bundle of papers tied with black ribbon. At the center of the bundle was a single envelope marked only with the date April 15th, 1910. The letter inside was written in Alden's unmistakable hand, her lines straight and evenly spaced, her words deliberate. She spoke not of guilt, but of pride, referring to her work as smoothing the mind's creases, describing the process as one would a fine craft. She wrote that most children carry defects invisible to their parents, creases in the soul, where filth could collect thoughts and feelings that could not be scrubbed away with lessons or punishment. Her method, she claimed, was the only way to press the soul flat so nothing unclean could hide. She did not mention the tuning fork or the freezing basins by name, but she described sessions in which the subject stood without movement, until the self dissolved into pure capacity, no longer hindered by doubt or unrest. She insisted that this was not cruelty but refinement, and that the children she had completed were free from the burdens of ordinary minds. The letter named 13 such children her true completions. They were the same 13 whose clothing had been found folded on the desks the day she vanished. Each name was followed by a short note. Words like stillness achieved, soul pressed, no return. There was no acknowledgement of their absence from the world, no hint of their fate beyond the perfection she believed she had given them. The tone was calm, almost tender, as if she were describing cherished works of art rather than human lives. At the bottom of the page, her final line read, "The work is finished here, but the method endures." No signature followed, only the looping symbol that had appeared beside the chosen names in the attendance list and ledger. The rest of the trunk contained nothing of obvious significance, no photographs, no further documents. But the ribbon from the letter had left a faint indentation in the papers beneath, as if it had been tied too tightly for too long. Those who read the confession described an odd sensation while holding it, a pressure at the temples and a faint hum at the edge of hearing. The letter now sits in sealed storage, rarely viewed, but its existence confirms what had been suspected for decades: that Alden's work was not the product of impulse or madness, but of a cold, deliberate belief in the perfection of erasure, carried out with the precision of someone who thought herself a savior. No trial was ever held for Theodora Alden. By the time her methods were pieced together through scraps of ledgers, whispered memories, and the confession found in that trunk, she had been gone for nearly 70 years. The children she had marked as completions were never found, no graves identified, no bones recovered. Officially, they remain missing. Unofficially, their absence has been accepted as permanent by a town that learned long ago not to ask certain questions. Yet the Coldwell case, though never named as such in public records, bled into policy. By 1913, new laws required that all private schools undergo annual inspections, that student rosters be verified against census and family records, that any prolonged absence be reported beyond the institution itself. These changes were spoken of in dry language, but their roots lay in the unspoken knowledge of what had happened inside those brick walls. Still, there was no justice for the dead, no reckoning for the vanished. In the town square, a memorial plaque was placed on a low granite pedestal in 1955. It bears no names, no dates, only the words, "For those we could not keep." To an outsider, it could mark a war or an epidemic. To the people who remember Coldwell, it is something else entirely. They do not speak of it to strangers, but sometimes, in the fading light of late autumn, an older resident will pause before it, their gaze fixed not on the engraving but on the empty lot beyond the trees. The site of the school remains fenced and unused, though the singing has been heard as recently as the past decade. No official acknowledgement of those voices exists. The recordings made by investigators remain locked away, dismissed by authorities as hoaxes or unexplained anomalies. Yet the hum of the past lingers here in ways that do not require proof. It is in the way parents still watch the lot when walking their children home, in the way certain streets fall silent at dusk, in the unease that clings to buildings rumored to have been built from its bricks. The story is told less and less now, replaced by a kind of inherited caution, a quiet, wordless understanding that what happened once could happen again, if given the same stillness, the same protection, the same unchecked authority. Evil here did not wear a monstrous face or raise its voice. It smiled, it stood straight, it spoke softly, it waited. It operated not in chaos, but in order, each act precise, each cruelty wrapped in the language of care. And that is the most dangerous kind of evil, the kind that hums patiently in places meant for safety, the kind that leaves no scars on the walls but marks the ground forever. So the question remains for those who hear the hum, for those who look too long at the fence. What do you think? Could this happen again?